Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Years ago, before my wife and I had kids, we took a trip out to the East Coast on vacation, and we spent a couple of days on Cape Cod. I love the ocean, and I had a great idea. We would get up before sunrise and go out to the beach and watch the sun come up together. Now, I'm not a big morning person, but this I was willing to get up for. So we set our alarm way too early. I mean, there's no sense in getting up early to see the sunrise and then missing the sunrise. So you've got to get up even earlier than you think. And we got out there, we set our alarm, we drove out and parked up on the ridge by the lighthouse in Chatham, looking out across the Atlantic to the east, and we waited in the dark along with some others. And as we stood outside our car, we discovered that the bugs were pretty thick. Bugs are not really my thing either. Maria went back into the car. I followed. And then after a bit, it did seem like we were starting to see some lights, so we got back out of the car. And we were waiting for that perfect moment when that splash of light just shoots out across the horizon. But it was more like we started to see this kind of veiled glow. We thought it must be just under the horizon. And a few minutes passed, and it was getting brighter, but we wondered, was the sun up or not? We weren't sure, and we waited a little longer. And we thought it must be so close. And then it became clear there was a thick fog out over the ocean. And we could now make out the shape of the sun behind the fog, but it was just a muddled glow. We tried. In the story of Easter, we hear on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb taking the spices that they had prepared. I can imagine the women walking through that time between dark and light, still a bit difficult to see. The world and what it held, not so clear. On Easter morning, we celebrate the resurrection, but even the women and the disciples in those first hours couldn't make it out clearly yet. Like the sun rising behind fog, they were perplexed. The stone was rolled away from the tomb. It was empty. And then they were frightened as two men in all they could describe as dazzling clothes stood beside them. These figures asked, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, but is risen." And then they could begin to make out the shape of this good news. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over and be crucified and on the third day rise again. And then they remembered his words, and they told all this to the 11 and all the rest. The announcement of these two messengers is startling and clear. But sometimes the hope and good news we seek comes veiled and with more uncertainty than we expect. We have to peer through unexpected loss and confusion, fears and time to finally appreciate that good news has come. These women and the disciples had watched the unthinkable over a short period of time. They saw Jesus arrested and then crucified. Everything seemed lost. The darkness appeared to have won. Most of us can relate to some moment in life when everything seemed impossible, when the way forward was shrouded. When the women came to the tomb with spices, it was just a small simple step. They were still in grief. It couldn't have been easy to get up that early for a task that offered no real hope, but just a small amount of dignity to the body of Jesus. He was their advocate, their teacher, Mary's son, and the one they had expected to be the Messiah. It was by taking that small, seemingly hollow step of going to the tomb that a new future and good news emerged for them. As we learn to live with grief and move forward with actions that can seem otherwise futile, we end up wandering into places where God's grace can be found. My grandfather grew up in Cottagewood along Carson Bay, just a few miles from here. And when I was growing up in this area, he shared stories about the history of Lake Minnetonka when old hotels lined the shores and streetcar boats would transport people all over the lake. He recalled riding the boats with his mother when he was a very small child. I loved hearing those stories as a kid. But that era was ending, and when he was 10 years old, he stood on the shores of Cottagewood looking out to the big lake and watched as the Minnetonka streetcar boat was sunk in the middle of the lake, no longer needed. 5 years before that, his mother Amanda had died. 2.5 years after the Minnetonka sunk, and just months before the crash of 1929, his father John, who had been caretaker of large summer lake cottages in the area, also died. My grandfather had become an orphan along with his older brother. I never recall him using that word about himself, but he was able to stay in Cottagewood and live with his uncle through high school. And after marrying my grandmother, they moved to Hopkins, and he worked at Minneapolis Moline, later White Motors, for many years. Then, over 50 years later, a team had discovered the shape of a hull at the bottom of Lake Minnetonka. It turned out to be the Minnetonka streetcar boat buried under muck, and in 1980, they raised it from the bottom of the lake. My grandfather was there on the shore to see it again as it was towed to Excelsior. About 10 years later, work had begun on restoring it to carry passengers again. As an engineer and someone who loved working with wood and tools, he joined the team. And it was at that time that my grandmother died. Alone now, it became almost his sole calling and purpose to see the boat restored. And his passion and joy was invested in that boat. After several years of work, he was on board for the inaugural voyage. And then sometime later, I took the trip by his side from Wayzata to Excelsior, past Cottagewood, where he had seen the boat sunk from shore and then raised again. And years later, I was able to take our family on the boat when my son was about 10 years old, the age my grandfather had been when the boat was first sunk. I think about my grandfather and that old boat lost for decades in the depths of the lake, and I think about how, by God's grace, we are able to witness renewal and resurrection, not just in boats, but in people out of their grief and loss. We're able to see new futures emerge from storylines that seem uncertain and at times impossible. Amazing and miraculous things happen in life, not perhaps because God intervenes and directly impacts the events of our lives or history in every case, but because creation and existence itself is built on a miracle and immeasurable depths of grace and love. While the world we experience can seem at times broken and filled with grief, there is also grace to be discovered in so many different directions. We have to open our eyes to it. Sometimes we can only make out the contours of it, whether it's through thick fog or watery depths. But if we step out to investigate it, we open ourselves to hope. The women awoke early in the morning simply out of duty. The only thing they really had left in that moment was to honor the body and memory of Jesus. It's kind of revealing how we choose to care for the deceased. You know, if we bring a cold calculus to it, perhaps there's little need for all of the preparations. If necessity had been their only guide, bringing spices that morning may have seemed a bit extravagant. But there is generosity in grace. Sometimes it seems purposeless. There's a generosity in showing dignity even when it cannot be acknowledged or received. Life is built on these small moments of generosity and grace, of dignifying life even when it's gone. It was as the women showed up that their lives were changed. They went to tell the disciples who were in isolation, but it seemed to them at first to be an idle tale. Yet one of them, Peter, went to investigate himself. He stepped out and stepped into the entrance to the tomb to see it empty. And when he tended to the facts of the story and the witness of the women, he saw the contours of new hope for himself. What exactly it meant in that moment and how the story would unfold was still unclear, but he could see the outlines of a whole new future. I think we often become accustomed to prepackaged meals and prepared answers, detailed descriptions of everything we can expect. But with the resurrection and with the hope we seek today, perhaps all we can see is the contour of it first. The adventure that lies ahead is discovering what will emerge between the lines. I mean, you may not have realized that when all of us were children, there was a point to coloring in all of those pictures, imagining the colors and the world in between the lines. When Maria and I went out to see the sunrise that morning, we expected to see it in all of its detail and wonder, but the sun did rise, and it gave witness to what turned out to be a more realistic and interesting vision for how life unfolds, fog and all. I wonder sometimes if our need for a perfect view of things and a clear and simple future gets in our way of embracing the complexity, mystery, and goodness of life as it really is. In our need for clarity, it's so easy to get stuck in either pessimism on one hand or with rose-colored glasses on the other. Both can miss some aspect of the reality in front of us. But faith is the determination and the courage to live within the tension between what we hope for and what we truly see. Christian faith is built on the message of the cross, after all. Jesus experienced the deepest pain and hopelessness of the human experience, and yet was raised to new life. Death is real, but it doesn't have the final word. That is the good news for today. In the end, the promise of the resurrection is about more than the experiences of transformation and renewal that we experience here and now. The ultimate promise of Easter is about a life that transcends the here and now. Jesus came as Son of God. In the coming weeks, we will hear stories of the resurrected Jesus appearing to his disciples. And for our modern minds, I think it can still be hard for us to make sense of those stories, to reconcile them. For some, they may seem almost too fantastical. Even the disciples, after first hearing the report from the women, considered it an idle tale. And yet science in the realm of quantum physics points to realities too mysterious almost to believe. Research has shed light into quantum entanglement, in which two particles or molecules separated by thousands of miles can instantly relate to one another. It shows that time does not exist in the way that we really think it does. As we consider these new types of mystery, can we hold the miracles and the mysteries of Jesus and the resurrection alongside it? St. Paul wrote, "Now we see through a mirror dimly, then we will see face to face." The hope of the resurrection will always be seen in this life as if through a veil of a morning fog, even as the sun still rises. Our Easter hope follows the witness of the apostles, who point not just to resurrection, but also to the nature and quality of this new life and the teachings of Jesus. And about that, we have some more clarity. Just like you can identify a tree by the fruit it produces, we can see the nature of true Christian faith in how it grows and matures over years. St. Paul said the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All of us are works in progress, and we never stop learning and growing, but Jesus invites us to tend to our souls and to watch for signs of new life, to help foster compassion and love over fear and animosity. The realities we see outside and within sometimes give us pause. But today, God is ready to do a new thing. God's loving power is shared with you today in forgiveness and grace, peace, compassion, and hope. If you have moments when you're perplexed or afraid, frail or disheartened, join with the women and with Peter and place yourself at the entrance to the tomb, where stooping and looking in, Peter saw the linen cloths by themselves and then went home amazed at what had happened. The message of new life that we can see taking shape in this story and in our own hearts has a power to heal and renew, even in the face of uncertain realities. It can seem almost too good to be true. But when we take the step to share in this generous and gracious good news, hope and life arise from behind the veil. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.